There are places that don't disappear, even after everything around them is gone. Stone villages with no people, walls that still mark boundaries but protect nothing, entrances that lead somewhere but no longer lead anywhere. And the strange part is, they still make sense as structures, but not fully, as stories. In this video we're exploring ancient sites built from stone, forts, villages, gates and carved spaces, places that still hold their shape, their layout, their intention, but not the full explanation behind them. Before we go further, tell me where you're watching from and what time it is right now. And if this kind of quiet mystery pulls you in, make sure to subscribe. Because what you're about to see isn't just ruins, it's structure without context, design without complete answers. The stone fort built on a hill that still feels guarded, Rathgall Stone Fort. Grass moving slowly with the wind, open land stretching outward, nothing that immediately suggests something complex beneath it. But the shape of the hill isn't natural, because as you get closer the lines begin to appear, circles, stone boundaries, layers built into the land itself, and that's where the structure reveals itself. This is Rathgall. And what makes it stand out is not just that it's a hill fort, but how it was constructed, because instead of a single wall or barrier, it is built in multiple concentric rings, each one reinforcing the next, creating a layered defense that expands outward, and that changes how the space is understood. The outer rings are wide, built from stone and earth, forming boundaries that follow the natural curve of the hill, suggesting that the builders worked with the landscape rather than against it. And that approach matters, because it shows adaptation. The walls are not perfectly uniform, they vary, shaped by terrain, adjusted to elevation, which means the construction was responsive, not rigid, and that reflects awareness, because it shows that the builders understood the ground they were working with. As you move inward, the structure becomes more defined, the rings tighten, the space narrows, guiding movement toward the centre, creating a controlled path rather than an open approach. And that design is intentional, because it shapes how entry happens. The central area is elevated, surrounded, protected by the layers outside it, suggesting that this inner space held importance beyond the outer rings. And that raises a question, because the effort to build multiple layers implies purpose. The stones themselves are large enough to create stability, placed without mortar, held together by weight and positioning, forming walls that have remained in place for long periods. And that method reflects understanding, because it shows that balance was used instead of binding. The visibility from the hill is wide, open views across the surrounding land, allowing anything approaching to be seen from a distance. And that positioning adds function, because it gives the structure awareness of its surroundings. But Rathgall is not just about defence, because within the inner space there are signs that suggest activity, not just protection, but use. And that adds another layer, because it shifts the structure from purely defensive to something more complex. The presence of burial features in and around the site introduces another dimension, because it suggests that the hill held meaning beyond immediate function, possibly connected to memory, continuity, or significance over time, and that connection changes interpretation, because it shows that the site may have served multiple roles. The layout is not random. Each ring follows a pattern, a system that repeats but adjusts slightly, indicating that the design was planned even if it adapted to the terrain, and that balance reflects control, because it shows that structure and environment were integrated. The effort required to build Rathgall would have been sustained. Stone gathered, placed, layer by layer, not a single action, but a process extended over time, and that continuity reflects organisation, because it shows that the work was maintained. Even now the rings remain, visible, defined, still shaping the hill, allowing the structure to be recognised clearly even after long periods, and that persistence keeps it relevant. The contrast between simplicity and complexity is what defines Rathgall, because from a distance it looks simple, but up close the layers reveal planning, adaptation and purpose, and that difference creates curiosity, because it shows that not everything is immediately visible. The function of Rathgall is not fully limited to a single explanation, because it combines elements of defence, structure and possibly ritual or significance tied to the land itself, and that combination keeps the interpretation open and maybe that is what makes Rathgall stand out. Not just because it was built on a hill, but because the hill itself became part of the structure, shaped into something that controls movement, defines space, and remains visible long after its original purpose has faded. A layered design, built with stone, integrated into the land, still visible, still structured, and that presence is what remains. The cave system carved into a cliff that still holds its pattern, Valeron Caves. A steep rock face rising sharply, shaped by time, with rough surfaces and uneven edges that feel untouched. But then, the openings begin to appear, small, repeated, cut into the stone in a way that doesn't follow natural patterns, and that's where everything changes. Because this is not just a cave, this is the Valeron Cave Complex, and what makes it stand out is not just that it exists within a cliff, but how it was shaped, because instead of a single open space, the rock face has been carved into multiple chambers, each one placed with intention, creating a structure that feels organised rather than random. And that changes how the site is understood. The openings are small, uniform in size, positioned across the surface in a way that suggests planning, forming a pattern that repeats but adapts slightly to the shape of the rock, and that pattern reflects control, because it shows that the carving followed a system. The chambers extend inward, cut into the stone, creating enclosed spaces that are separated from each other, indicating that each section had its own defined boundary, and that separation matters, because it suggests individual use. The height of the cliff adds complexity, because accessing these chambers requires movement along the rock face, indicating that entry was not simple or open, but controlled and deliberate. And that difficulty adds purpose, because it shows that access may have been restricted. The stone itself is workable, but not soft, meaning that carving these chambers required effort, repeated action, and consistency across multiple sections. And that effort reflects planning, because it shows that the work was sustained over time. The arrangement of the chambers is not perfectly symmetrical, but it is not random either. There is a balance between repetition and adaptation, suggesting that the builders adjusted, their design based on the structure of the rock, and that balance reflects awareness, because it shows that the environment influenced the construction. The number of chambers is significant, because this is not a small set of openings, but a large collection, indicating that the site served a function that required multiple separate spaces, and that scale adds importance, because it shows that the structure was used extensively. The purpose of the caves is often associated with storage, because the individual chambers could hold materials, protected within the rock, shielded from external conditions, and that interpretation aligns with the structure, but it does not fully explain everything, because the effort required to carve so many chambers suggests that the function was important enough to justify that work, and that raises questions. The positioning of the site within the landscape matters, because being elevated and carved into a cliff provides natural protection, reducing exposure and limiting access. And that positioning reflects intention, because it shows that location was chosen carefully. The interior of the chambers is enclosed, defined, creating spaces that are separate from the outside environment, indicating that what was placed inside was meant to be contained. And that containment adds meaning, because it suggests purpose. The repetition of the chambers creates a visual pattern across the cliff, a grid-like arrangement that stands out against the natural rock, making it clear that this is not a natural formation, and that visibility reflects design, because it shows that the structure is deliberate. Even now, the caves remain, cut into the stone, their openings still visible, their structure still intact, allowing them to be observed directly. And that persistence keeps them relevant. The contrast between natural and constructed is what defines this site, because the cliff is natural, but the chambers are not. And that difference creates impact, because it shows how the environment was shaped. The effort required to create this complex suggests coordination, because carving multiple chambers into a cliff is not a single action, but a repeated process that requires consistency. And that consistency reflects organisation. The exact function of every chamber is not fully defined, because while general interpretations exist, the specifics of how each space was used are not completely preserved, and that uncertainty adds depth, because it leaves space for interpretation. And maybe that is what makes the Valeron Caves stand out, not just because they are carved into a cliff, but because of how they are arranged, a system of spaces built into stone, each one defined, repeated and placed with intention, a rock face transformed, openings cut into its surface, spaces created within, and that pattern. The stone village that still holds the shape of daily life, Carn Uni. An open landscape. Low stone remains scattered across the ground, nothing rising high enough to dominate the view, but as you move closer, the pattern begins to appear. Circular outlines, defined walls, paths that seem to guide movement between structures, and slowly the space starts to feel less like ruins and more like a place that once functioned with purpose. This is Carn Uni. And what makes it stand out is not just that it is an ancient village, but how much of its layout still remains visible, because the arrangement of buildings, pathways and enclosed spaces creates a structure that still reflects how people once lived within it, and that changes everything. The buildings are circular, stone walls forming enclosed spaces that define individual units, each one separated but connected through proximity, suggesting a balance between independence and community. And that structure reflects planning, because it shows that the layout was intentional. The walls are low now, but their thickness remains clear, built to create stability, forming boundaries that define interior space while also providing support. And that construction reflects understanding, because it shows that durability was important. The arrangement of these circular structures is not random. They are placed in relation to each other, creating a layout that allows movement between them, forming pathways that are subtle but consistent. And that flow matters, because it shows that the village was organised. The entrances to these structures are narrow, controlled, positioned in ways that guide entry, suggesting that access to each space was defined rather than open. And that design reflects function, because it shapes how each space is used. Within the village, one structure stands out, more enclosed, more defined, partially underground. This is often referred to as a fogu, and its presence changes the interpretation of the site, because it introduces a different type of space. The fogu is narrow, subterranean, built with stone walls and covered passages that create an interior separate from the surface structures, and that separation is important, because it suggests a different function. The purpose of this underground structure is not fully agreed upon, because while it could be used for storage, protection or other roles, its exact use is not completely defined. And that uncertainty adds depth, because it leaves space for interpretation. The integration of surface buildings with underground space suggests complexity, because it shows that the village was not limited to what is visible above ground, and that layering reflects design, because it shows that multiple types of space were used. The materials used throughout the site are consistent, stone gathered locally, shaped and placed to form walls that follow the natural contours of the land. And that consistency reflects adaptation, because it shows that the builders worked with what was available. The scale of the village is moderate, not vast, but large enough to indicate a functioning community, with multiple structures supporting daily activity, and that scale reflects life, because it shows that the site was used regularly. The positioning of the village within the landscape provides visibility, open surroundings, allowing movement to be observed while also integrating the site into the terrain rather than isolating it. And that placement reflects awareness, because it shows that location mattered. The condition of the structures today allows the layout to still be read. Even without roofs or complete walls, the shapes remain clear enough to understand the arrangement, and that clarity is important, because it preserves the design. The repetition of circular forms creates a visual rhythm across the site, a pattern that defines the village, making it distinct from more linear or angular layouts. And that pattern reflects identity, because it shows that the design follows a consistent approach. The absence of certain details, such as upper structures or internal elements, limits full understanding, because what remains is primarily the foundation, leaving aspects of daily use open to interpretation. And that limitation adds uncertainty, because it leaves gaps. Even now, Carn Uni remains quiet, open, its stone outlines still visible, allowing the village to be experienced as a layout rather than a complete structure. And that persistence keeps it relevant. The contrast between presence and absence is what defines this site, because the structure is still there, but the details of life within it are not. And that difference creates curiosity, because it shows that form can survive even when function fades. The integration of surface and underground space, the organisation of circular structures, and the adaptation to the landscape all point to a system that was both practical and intentional, but not fully explained in every detail. And maybe that is what makes Carnuni stand out. Not just because it was a village, but because it still holds the shape of how people lived, a layout preserved in stone showing structure, movement and connection, even without the presence of those who built it. A series of circles, connected by paths, layered with hidden space, and that design. The massive stone walls that still define the landscape, Teldan ramparts. A wide area, calm, quiet, with no immediate sign of something massive beneath the surface. But then, the elevation shifts, the ground rises, not naturally, but gradually, in a way that suggests shaping rather than formation. And that's where the structure begins to reveal itself. This is Teldan, and what makes it stand out is not just the presence of walls, but the scale at which they were built, because these are not simple boundaries, but massive ramparts constructed to surround and define an entire settlement. And that changes how the space is understood. The ramparts are made of stone and earth, layered together to create thick, sloping walls that rise outward rather than straight up, forming a structure that absorbs weight and pressure rather than resisting it directly. And that design reflects understanding, because it shows that stability was built into the shape itself. The width of these ramparts is significant. Not narrow barriers, but broad structures that extend across the landscape, creating a boundary that is both visible and functional, and that scale matters, because it shows that the goal was not minimal protection, but sustained defence. The surface of the ramparts follows the natural contours of the land, curving, adapting, indicating that the builders worked with the terrain rather than forcing a rigid layout. And that approach reflects awareness, because it shows that the environment was part of the design. The height of the walls would have created a strong visual presence, rising above the surrounding ground, forming a perimeter that defines the settlement clearly, separating interior from exterior, and that separation is important, because it establishes control. The materials used were gathered locally, stone combined with earth to create a structure that is both heavy and stable, using weight as a primary element of strength, and that method reflects practicality, because it shows that available resources were used effectively. The construction of such ramparts required coordination, because building at this scale is not a single action, but a process carried out over time, involving multiple stages of layering, shaping, and reinforcement. And that process reflects organisation, because it shows that the work was structured, the entrances into the settlement were controlled, limited, defined by openings that could be monitored, indicating that movement into and out of the space was not unrestricted. And that control adds purpose, because it shows that access was managed. The presence of gates within these ramparts introduces another layer, because gateways are not just openings, but points of transition, where interior meets exterior, where movement is directed and observed, and that placement reflects design, because it shows that entry points were intentional. The slope of the ramparts reduces direct impact, because angled surfaces distribute force more effectively than vertical ones, suggesting that the structure was designed with durability in mind, and that reflects understanding, because it shows awareness of how structures respond to pressure. The interior space enclosed by the ramparts would have contained activity, structures, movement, indicating that the walls were not isolated, but part of a larger system that included the settlement itself, and that connection adds meaning, because it shows that the ramparts define space, not just protect it. The effort required to construct these walls would have been substantial. Material gathered, transported, placed layer by layer, a process that reflects sustained activity rather than a single event, and that continuity reflects planning, because it shows that the project was maintained. Even now the ramparts remain, their shape still visible, their presence still defining the landscape, allowing the structure to be understood even without its original height fully intact. And that persistence keeps it relevant. The contrast between natural terrain and constructed form is what defines Teldan, because the land is natural, but the shape is not. And that difference creates impact, because it shows how the environment was shaped. The purpose of these ramparts is generally understood as defensive, but their scale suggests that they also serve to define identity, to mark the boundaries of a place, creating a clear distinction between inside and outside, and that adds another layer, because it shows that the walls are not just functional, but symbolic. And maybe that is what makes the ramparts of Tel Dan stand out, not just because they are large, but because of how they are integrated into the landscape, structures that combine earth and stone into a form that shapes space, controls movement, and remains visible long after its original function has faded, a rising boundary, layered and shaped, defining a place, and that structure. The circular stone forts that still hold their form, Kerry stone forts, rolling hills, grass stretching outward, stone scattered naturally across the land, blending into the terrain, but then the shapes begin to stand out, circles, defined, too precise to be natural, and that's where the structure reveals itself. These are the stone forts of Kerry, and what makes them stand out is not just their number, but how consistently they are built, because across the landscape, similar circular enclosures appear again and again, each one formed from stone, each one following a pattern that is both simple and controlled, and that changes how the land is understood. The forts are circular, walls forming complete enclosures that define a clear boundary between interior and exterior, creating a space that is separated from the surrounding environment. And that separation matters because it shows intention. The walls are thick, built from stacked stone placed without mortar, relying on weight and positioning to maintain stability, forming structures that have remained intact over long periods. And that method reflects understanding, because it shows that balance was used instead of binding. The height of the walls varies, some rising higher than others depending on location and condition, but always enough to create a sense of enclosure. And that variation reflects adaptation, because it shows that each fort responds to its surroundings. The entrances are narrow, defined openings that interrupt the circular wall, guiding movement into the interior, suggesting that access was controlled rather than open. And that control adds purpose, because it shapes how the space is entered. Inside the forts, the space is contained, enclosed, often level compared to the outer terrain, creating an area that feels separate from the surrounding land. And that containment reflects function, because it suggests that the interior had a specific use. Some forts include additional features within, stone divisions, secondary structures, indicating that the space was not empty, but organised in a way that supported activity. And that organisation adds complexity, because it shows that the forts were more than simple enclosures. The placement of these forts across the landscape is not random. They are positioned on elevated ground, hills, or areas with clear visibility, allowing wide views of the surrounding terrain, and that positioning reflects awareness, because it shows that location was chosen carefully. The repetition of circular design across multiple sites suggests a shared method, a system that was understood and applied consistently, indicating that the builders followed a recognizable approach, and that repetition reflects knowledge, because it shows that the design was not isolated. The purpose of these forts is often associated with habitation or protection, spaces where people lived, gathered or sought, security within defined boundaries, but the exact function of each site may have varied, and that variation adds depth, because it shows that the forts may have served multiple roles. The effort required to build these structures would have been sustained, stone collected from the surrounding area, stacked carefully, layer by layer, a process that reflects time and coordination rather than a single action, and that continuity reflects organisation, because it shows that the work was maintained. The relationship between the forts and the landscape is strong, because the materials come from the land itself, and the structures follow its contours, creating a connection between environment and construction. And that connection reflects integration, because it shows that the forts belong to the terrain. Even now the forts remain, their circular walls still visible, their forms still intact, allowing them to be recognised clearly across the landscape, and that persistence keeps them relevant. The contrast between simplicity and structure is what defines these forts, because the design is simple, but the result is controlled, and that difference creates impact, because it shows how consistent methods can produce lasting forms. The absence of complete details about life within these forts leaves space for interpretation, because while the structures remain, the full context of their use is not entirely preserved, and that uncertainty adds mystery, because it leaves questions unanswered. And maybe that is what makes the Kerry stone forts stand out, not just because they are circular, but because of how consistently they appear, structures that define space with simple materials repeated across the land in a way that suggests a shared understanding. Stone arranged into form, circles carved into the landscape, boundaries that still hold, and that pattern, the stone tower complex that still dominates the landscape, Nurage su Nuraxi. A stone tower rising from the ground, weathered, solid, standing alone against the open landscape. But as you move closer, it becomes clear that it isn't just one tower, it's a system, layered, expanded, built outward over time, and that's where the complexity begins. This is Nuragi su Nuraxi, and what makes it stand out is not just the central tower, but the entire complex surrounding it, because what appears simple from a distance reveals multiple layers of construction, creating a structure that grows from a single core into something much larger, and that changes everything. The central tower is massive, built from large stones stacked without mortar, forming a circular structure that rises upward, narrowing slightly as it gains height, creating stability through shape rather than binding. And that design reflects understanding, because it shows that weight and form were used together. The stones themselves are heavy, irregular in shape but placed in a way that creates alignment, forming walls that are both thick and stable. And that placement reflects control, because it shows that each stone was positioned deliberately. The entrance to the tower is narrow, low, requiring movement to adjust, creating a controlled entry point that leads into the interior space. And that design matters, because it defines access. Inside the tower, the space is enclosed, circular, with walls that rise upward, creating a vertical interior that feels contained, directing attention toward the centre. And that enclosure reflects function, because it shows that the interior was defined. The structure expands outward from this central tower, additional walls, secondary towers, creating a complex that surrounds the original core, indicating that the site developed over time rather than being built all at once, and that growth reflects continuity. Because it shows that the structure evolved, the outer walls form a boundary, connecting the towers, creating a perimeter that defines the space, separating interior from exterior, and that boundary reflects organisation, because it shows that the layout was planned. Beyond the main structure, there are additional remains, circular huts, arranged around the central complex, forming a village that connects to the tower system, and that connection adds another layer, because it shows that the site was inhabited. The arrangement of these huts is not random. They are placed in relation to each other, creating pathways and open areas that suggest movement and interaction within the space. And that layout reflects design, because it shows that the settlement was structured. The materials used throughout the site are consistent, stone gathered locally, shaped and placed to form both large towers and smaller structures, indicating that the same approach was applied across different scales. And that consistency reflects knowledge, because it shows that the method was understood. The height of the central tower would have made it visible from a distance, standing above the surrounding landscape, creating a focal point that defines the site. And that visibility adds purpose, because it shows that the structure was meant to be seen. The function of the complex is not limited to a single explanation, because it combines elements of defense, habitation, and structure, suggesting that it served multiple roles over time, and that combination adds complexity, because it shows that the site was not static. The effort required to build such a complex would have been significant. Stone gathered, transported, placed layer by layer, a process that reflects sustained activity over time rather than a single construction phase. And that continuity reflects organisation, because it shows that the work was maintained. The absence of mortar across the structures highlights the reliance on weight and balance, indicating that the stability of the complex depends on the precise placement of stones. And that method reflects understanding, because it shows that the builders worked with gravity rather than against it. Even now the complex remains, the central tower still standing, the surrounding structures still visible, allowing the full layout to be understood even without complete preservation. And that persistence keeps it relevant. The contrast between simplicity and complexity is what defines Nurage su Nuraxi, because the individual elements are simple, but their combination creates a system, and that difference creates impact, because it shows how layered construction can transform a single structure into a complex environment. The relationship between the tower and the surrounding village suggests connection, because the central structure defines the space, while the surrounding huts indicate activity, creating a balance between structure and life, and that balance reflects purpose, because it shows that the site functioned as more than just a single building, and maybe that is what makes Nuragesu-Nuraxi stand out, not just because of its height, but because of how it grows, a structure that begins as a single tower and expands into a complex system, integrating architecture, space and activity into one connected form, a central core, surrounded by layers, built with stone, still standing, and that structure, the single stone that was carved into a chamber, Dwarfy Stane. In the middle of an open landscape, there's a single massive stone that doesn't try to stand out, but still draws attention in a way that feels difficult to explain. It doesn't rise high like a monument, and it isn't part of a larger structure. It sits alone, heavy, grounded, shaped by time and weather, blending into its surroundings just enough to be overlooked at a distance. But the moment you move closer, the difference becomes clear, because this is not just a stone left behind by nature. Inside it, there is space. This is the Dwarfy Stane, and what makes it stand out is not simply its presence, but what was done to it. Instead of assembling materials to create a structure, the builders chose a single massive block and carved into it, removing stone from within to create a chamber that exists entirely inside one continuous piece. That decision changes how the structure is understood because it reverses the usual process of construction. Instead of building upward or outward, this structure is defined by subtraction. The stone itself is large and solid, resting where it was left, not moved into place as part of a system, but existing as a single unit that contains both exterior form and interior function. There are no joints, no connecting pieces, no visible assembly. Everything depends on the integrity of that one mass. And that continuity is important, because it means that the entire structure relies on the stability of a single material. The entrance is narrow and low, positioned in a way that requires movement to adjust before entering. It is not an open or inviting entry, but a controlled threshold, one that creates a clear transition between the outside environment and the enclosed space within. That transition matters, because it defines how the space is experienced. Inside, the chamber is fully enclosed. Stone surrounds you on every side, forming walls, ceiling, and floor from the same continuous material. The space feels contained, quiet, separated from the landscape outside despite being carved from the same rock, and that separation creates a shift in perception. The surfaces inside are shaped with intention. They are not left rough or uneven, but worked enough to show consistency across the chamber. The lines are controlled, the space defined, indicating that the carving was not random but carefully guided. That consistency reflects sustained effort, because shaping an interior space within solid stone requires time, patience, and a method that maintains control over the material. The scale of the chamber is limited, but not accidental. It is large enough to serve a purpose, but not expanded beyond what the stone allows. The dimensions feel measured, suggesting that the size was chosen deliberately rather than discovered during the process. And that proportion reflects planning. The act of carving into a single stone introduces constraints. Every cut removes material permanently, meaning that mistakes cannot easily be corrected. The process requires awareness of depth, thickness, and structural balance at every stage, and that requirement reflects understanding, because it shows that the builders were not simply shaping stone but managing it. The absence of multiple chambers or extended passages suggests that the design was focused. This is not a complex system of rooms, but a single, defined interior, contained within a single form. And that simplicity is part of what makes it stand out, because it shows restraint. The location of the stone within the landscape adds another layer to its presence. It is not hidden or concealed, but placed in an open area, visible against the terrain, suggesting that its position was part of its significance. It does not rely on isolation to create impact. It relies on contrast. The purpose of the chamber is not fully defined. It resembles a burial space, a place of containment, possibly connected to ritual or memory. But without complete evidence, its exact function remains uncertain, and that uncertainty adds depth, because it leaves space between what can be observed and what can be concluded. The effort required to create this structure would have been considerable. Material removed gradually, layer by layer, shaping the interior while preserving the integrity of the outer form, a process that demands consistency over time rather than speed, and that effort reflects intention, because it shows that the result mattered enough to justify the work. Even now, the stone remains, unmoved, unchanged in its fundamental form, its exterior still solid, its interior still accessible, allowing the structure to be experienced directly rather than imagined. And that persistence keeps it relevant. What defines the dwarfy stain is not complexity, but contrast. A single stone, transformed into a space, a solid mass made hollow. Simple form shaped with deliberate control. It doesn't dominate the landscape, it doesn't overwhelm with scale, but it introduces an idea that feels different, that a structure doesn't always need to be built. Sometimes it can be revealed, and that transformation is what remains. The stone circle that defines space without walls, Henge of Brodgar. Set between two bodies of water, on a narrow strip of land shaped by wind and time, there is a circle that doesn't rise like a fortress, or shelter like a village, but still holds a presence that feels deliberate. From a distance it appears simple, tall stones placed in a wide ring, open ground at the centre, nothing enclosing it in the traditional sense. But the longer you observe it, the more structured it becomes, because this is not just a circle of stones, it is a space that has been defined without being closed. This is the Henge of Brodgar, and what makes it stand out is not just the stones themselves, but the way the entire landscape is shaped around them, because the circle is surrounded by a ditch cut into the ground, creating a boundary that doesn't rely on walls, but still separates what is inside from what is outside, and that changes how the site is understood. The stones are tall, vertical, each one rising from the ground with slight variation in height and shape, creating a ring that feels consistent without being identical, and that variation reflects placement, because it shows that each stone was positioned individually, not manufactured as a uniform set. The spacing between the stones is controlled, not random, wide enough to allow visibility through the circle, but consistent enough to maintain the shape, suggesting that the arrangement follows a pattern rather than chance. And that pattern reflects design, because it shows that the circle was measured. The ditch surrounding the circle is wide, cut deep into the ground, forming a continuous ring that defines the perimeter, creating a boundary that is felt even though it is not built upward. And that boundary matters, because it separates space without enclosing it. The absence of a traditional wall creates openness, but that openness is controlled, because the ditch marks a clear limit, indicating that the interior space is distinct from the surrounding land, and that distinction reflects intention, because it shows that the area was defined. The positioning of the site within the landscape is significant, because it lies between bodies of water, creating a natural frame that enhances the sense of isolation and focus, suggesting that location was chosen with awareness, and that placement adds meaning, because it shows that the environment was part of the design. The stones themselves are set firmly into the ground, anchored, creating stability that allows them to remain upright over long periods, despite exposure to weather and time. And that stability reflects understanding, because it shows that placement was secure. The central space is open, wide, free of structures, creating an area that is defined by the surrounding stones rather than filled with objects. And that openness is important, because it creates focus. The arrangement of the stones suggests alignment, not only with each other, but potentially with features of the landscape or sky, though the exact purpose of these alignments is not fully defined, and that possibility adds another layer, because it connects the structure to observation. The effort required to construct the henge would have been considerable. Stone transported, positioned, the ditch excavated by removing large amounts of earth, shaping the ground itself into part of the structure. And that effort reflects planning, because it shows that the project was organised. The repetition of vertical stones creates a rhythm, a pattern that defines the circle visually, making it distinct from the surrounding terrain, even without solid walls or enclosed buildings, and that rhythm reflects identity. because it shows that the design is consistent. The purpose of the Henge of Brodgar is not fully defined, because while its structure is clear, the exact activities that took place within it are not completely preserved, and that uncertainty adds depth, because it leaves space for interpretation. The relationship between the stones, the ditch, and the surrounding landscape suggests integration, because the structure is not separate from the land, but shaped within it, using both built and natural elements to define space. And that integration reflects awareness, because it shows that the builders worked with the environment. Even now, the henge remains, the stones still standing, the ditch still visible, the circle still clear, allowing the structure to be understood even after long periods, and that persistence keeps it relevant. The contrast between openness and definition is what defines this site, because the space is open, but still controlled, and that difference creates impact, because it shows that boundaries do not always require walls. The scale of the circle creates presence, not through height or enclosure, but through arrangement, showing how positioning alone can define space. And that idea changes perception, because it shows that structure can exist without enclosure. And maybe that is what makes the Henge of Brodgar stand out, not just because of its stones, but because of how it defines space. A circle that creates separation without closing itself, a structure that shapes the land while remaining open to it. Vertical stones, a carved boundary, an open centre, and that design. The stone citadel preserved in a moment of destruction, Hassanlu. In a wide valley surrounded by distant hills and open land, there is a settlement that doesn't just show how people lived, but how everything ended. From above, the layout feels structured, walls defining boundaries, buildings arranged within them, a space that once held movement, activity, and order. But what makes this place different is not just its structure, it's the condition in which it was left behind. This is Hassanlu. And what makes it stand out is not only the stone citadel itself, but how much of its final moment appears to be preserved, because the site contains evidence of a sudden destruction, leaving behind a snapshot of a settlement that did not slowly fade but stopped abruptly. And that changes how the site is understood. The citadel is elevated, positioned on a mound that rises above the surrounding terrain, creating a natural advantage in visibility and defence, allowing the structure to overlook the landscape. And that positioning reflects awareness, because it shows that location was chosen deliberately. The walls are constructed from stone and mud brick, layered to form a boundary that defines the citadel clearly, separating interior space from the outside environment. And that separation matters, because it establishes control. Inside the walls, the layout becomes more detailed. Rooms, passageways, spaces arranged in relation to each other, forming a system that supports movement and activity. And that organisation reflects planning, because it shows that the settlement was structured. The buildings are connected, not isolated, creating a network of spaces that function together rather than independently. And that connection adds complexity, because it shows that the citadel operated as a system. What sets Hassanlu apart is the evidence of destruction. Burn layers, collapsed walls, objects left in place suggesting that the site was not gradually abandoned but affected by an event that halted activity suddenly. And that abruptness changes everything, because it preserves a moment. The remains found within the site indicate that people were present during this event, caught within the structures, leaving behind evidence of their final positions. And that presence adds weight, because it connects the structure to lived experience. The materials within the buildings include everyday objects, items that suggest daily life rather than ceremonial placement, indicating that the site was active and functioning before the destruction occurred. And that detail adds realism, because it shows that this was not an empty space. The layout of the citadel suggests both defence and habitation. Walls that protect, rooms that support living, indicating that the structure served multiple purposes simultaneously. And that combination adds depth, because it shows that the site was not limited to a single function. The construction of the walls reflects adaptation, using available materials to create stability, forming structures that respond to the environment rather than imposing rigid forms. And that approach reflects understanding, because it shows that the builders worked with the land. The pathways within the citadel guide movement, not random, but defined, creating routes that connect different areas, suggesting that the layout was designed for flow, and that flow reflects organisation, because it shows that movement was considered. The scale of the citadel is moderate but complete, large enough to function as a centre, small enough to remain contained, creating a space that feels both organised and accessible, and that scale reflects balance, because it shows that the size was appropriate for its function. The preservation of the site is what makes it unique, because instead of losing detail over time, the sudden destruction has maintained elements of the original layout, allowing the structure to be understood more clearly than sites that faded gradually. And that preservation adds value, because it keeps the details intact. The exact cause of the destruction is not fully defined. While evidence suggests conflict or fire, the complete sequence of events remains uncertain, and that uncertainty adds mystery, because it leaves space between evidence and explanation. Even now, Hasanlu remains, its walls partially standing, its layout still visible, its story preserved not just in structure, but in the condition in which it was left behind, and that persistence keeps it relevant. What defines Hasanlu is not just its construction, but its interruption, a place that was active, then suddenly still, a citadel that holds both structure and moment, walls that define space, rooms that show life, and evidence that everything changed, all at once, and that moment, the stone gate, that still marks an entry without a city, Archaeological foundations. On a stretch of land that now feels open and quiet, there are stones arranged in a way that suggests something once stood here with purpose. Not just walls, not just scattered remains, but an entrance, defined, deliberate, and still recognizable. This is Archaeological, and what makes it stand out is not just the site itself, but the remains of its stone gate foundations, because even without the full structure intact, the entrance is still clearly marked, indicating that this point was once designed to control movement into a defined space, and that changes how the site is understood. The gate is formed from large stone blocks, placed to create an opening that is both functional and symbolic, marking the transition between outside and inside, and that transition matters, because it defines entry. The stones are positioned with alignment, not random, each piece contributing to a shape that forms a clear passage, suggesting that the layout was planned rather than improvised, and that planning reflects intention, because it shows that the entrance was important, the foundations remain. While the upper structure is no longer complete, the base still defines the original position, allowing the scale and orientation of the gate to be understood. And that persistence is important, because it preserves the design. The entrance is wide enough to allow movement through it, but narrow enough to be controlled, indicating that access was not unrestricted but managed, and that control adds purpose, because it shows that entry was significant. What makes this gate different is the presence of carved stone elements, figures, shapes, details that are not purely structural but visual, suggesting that the gate served not only as an entry point, but also as a place of representation. And that adds another layer, because it shows that function and expression were combined. The carvings are set into the stone blocks, integrated into the structure rather than added separately, indicating that the design was considered from the beginning, and that integration reflects planning, because it shows that the visual elements were part of the construction. The positioning of these carvings suggests that they were meant to be seen by those approaching the gate, creating an interaction between the structure and those who pass through it. And that interaction matters, because it shapes perception. The surrounding area indicates that this gate once led into a larger settlement. Walls, structures, spaces that are no longer fully intact but still suggested by the arrangement of the remaining stones. And that context adds meaning, because it shows that the gate was part of a system. The effort required to construct such a gate would have been significant. Stone gathered, shaped, positioned carefully to form both structure and detail. A process that reflects coordination and time, and that effort reflects importance, because it shows that the entrance was not secondary. The alignment of the gate within the site suggests that it was positioned deliberately, not randomly placed, but oriented in a way that connects with the layout of the settlement, and that orientation reflects design, because it shows that the gate fits into a larger plan, the condition of the site today leaves gaps, missing upper structures, incomplete walls. But enough remains to understand the function and presence of the gate, and that partial preservation adds depth because it allows reconstruction through observation. The combination of structural foundations and carved elements creates a contrast, because the base is practical, while the details are expressive, and that combination defines the gate. The exact meaning of the carvings is not fully agreed upon, because while they are visible, their interpretation depends on context that is not completely preserved, and that uncertainty adds mystery, because it leaves room for interpretation. Even now, the gate foundations remain, their shape still clear, their position still defining an entry point that no longer leads into a complete structure, but still holds its original form, and that persistence keeps it relevant. What defines the Archaeological gate is not just what is present, but what is missing. An entrance without a complete enclosure, a threshold without a fully preserved interior, and that contrast creates impact, because it shows that even when structures are lost, certain elements remain strong enough to define the space. A passage marked in stone, carved with intention, positioned with purpose, and still standing as a point of entry, even without the city it once led into, and that threshold. The raised stone platform that doesn't follow the expected form, Monte d'Archaeological. In an open stretch of land where the terrain feels flat and uninterrupted, there is a structure that rises in a way that doesn't match anything around it. Not a tower, not a wall, not a village, but something elevated, layered, and intentionally shaped. This is Monte d'Archaeological, and what makes it stand out is not just its presence, but its form, because instead of following the circular or enclosed design seen in many surrounding structures, it rises as a stepped platform, creating a shape that feels structured in a different way. And that difference changes everything. The base is wide, solid, built from stone and earth, forming a foundation that supports the structure above, creating a platform that lifts the upper level away from the surrounding ground. And that elevation matters, because it creates separation. The structure is layered, built in stages that rise upward, forming a stepped appearance rather than a single vertical form, indicating that the design was developed with height in mind, and that layering reflects planning, because it shows that the structure was meant to rise. The ramp leading to the top is one of the most defining features, long, gradual, extending outward before reaching the elevated platform, creating a controlled path that guides movement upward rather than directly into the structure. And that path is important, because it defines approach. The presence of a ramp instead of steps changes how the structure is experienced, because it creates a continuous movement rather than segmented access, suggesting that the ascent was part of the design, and that movement adds meaning, because it shapes how the space is reached. The platform at the top is flat, open, defined by its elevation rather than enclosure, creating a space that stands apart from the ground below. And that openness is significant, because it suggests function without confinement. The materials used are consistent with the surrounding environment. Stone combined with earth, shaped into a structure that is stable and durable, indicating that the builders worked with available resources, and that consistency reflects adaptation, because it shows that the structure belongs to its environment. The absence of walls at the top contrasts with the strong base, because while the foundation is solid and enclosed, the upper platform remains open, creating a difference between support and function, and that contrast adds depth, because it shows that the structure serves more than one purpose. The scale of the structure is moderate but noticeable, large enough to stand out, small enough to remain integrated into the landscape, creating a balance between presence and connection, and that balance reflects intention, because it shows that the structure was designed to be seen, but not to dominate. The effort required to construct this platform would have been significant. Material gathered, layered, shaped to create elevation, a process that requires coordination and time rather than a single action, and that effort reflects organization, because it shows that the project was sustained. The form of Monte d'Archaeological does not align with many nearby structures, because its stepped, raised design differs from circular enclosures or enclosed buildings, suggesting that it served a different role, and that difference creates curiosity, because it sets the structure apart. The purpose of the site is not fully defined, because while the layout suggests that it was used for activity at the elevated level, the exact nature of that activity is not completely preserved, and that uncertainty adds depth, because it leaves space for interpretation. The alignment of the ramp and platform suggests that movement was directed, not random, but guided toward a specific point, indicating that the structure was designed to focus attention, and that focus reflects intention, because it shows that the design shapes behaviour. Even now, Monte Dacodi remains, its platform still raised, its ramp still visible, allowing the structure to be understood through its form, even without complete context, and that persistence keeps it relevant. What defines this site is contrast, a strong base, an open top, a gradual ascent leading to a defined space, a structure that lifts activity above the ground without enclosing it, and that difference changes how it is experienced, because it is not entered in the usual way, it is approached, reached, and then stood upon, and maybe that is what makes Monte Dacodi stand out. Not just because it rises, but because of how it does it, a structure that creates elevation not for height alone, but to define a space that feels separate, visible, and deliberate, a platform built from layers, a path that leads upward, an open space above, and that elevation, the hilltop settlement carved into stone that still holds its layout, Castro de Ularca. High above the surrounding land, where the terrain becomes uneven and rocky, there is a settlement that doesn't try to hide, but instead spreads across the hill as if it belongs to it. From a distance it feels scattered, stone shapes blending into the landscape, walls that don't immediately form clear boundaries, structures that appear irregular rather than planned. But as you move through it, the order begins to appear. Paths, defined spaces, carved forms that follow the contours of the hill, and slowly the entire layout reveals itself. This is Castro de Ularca, and what makes it stand out is not just its position, but how it was built into the terrain, because instead of reshaping the land completely, the structures adapt to the natural rock, creating a settlement that feels integrated rather than imposed. And that changes everything. The site is elevated, positioned on a hilltop that provides wide visibility across the surrounding area, allowing the entire landscape to be observed from a distance. And that positioning matters, because it adds awareness. The walls of the settlement are constructed from stone, thick, irregular in shape but placed carefully to form boundaries that define the space, creating enclosures that follow the uneven ground. And that construction reflects adaptation, because it shows that the builders worked with the terrain. The layout is not perfectly symmetrical. Structures are placed where the land allows them, forming a pattern that feels organic but still controlled. And that balance is important, because it shows that the design is responsive. The pathways within the settlement are subtle, not always clearly marked, but visible through the arrangement of stones and open spaces, guiding movement across the site, and that flow reflects organisation, because it shows that movement was considered. One of the most distinctive features of the site is the presence of carved stone elements, sections of rock shaped into defined forms, creating spaces that are not built from separate materials, but carved directly into the ground. And that method adds another layer, because it shows that construction and carving were combined. These carved areas are smooth compared to the surrounding rock, shaped with intention, indicating that effort was applied to create defined surfaces rather than leaving them natural, and that effort reflects control, because it shows that the shaping was deliberate. The settlement includes areas that appear to be communal, open spaces, larger than the surrounding structures, suggesting that they served a shared function within the site, and that scale adds meaning, because it shows that the settlement supported interaction. The presence of defensive walls around the hill indicates that the site was protected, not just defined, but secured, creating a boundary that separates the interior from the surrounding landscape, and that protection reflects purpose, because it shows that the settlement was defended. The materials used throughout the site are consistent, local stone, gathered and shaped to form walls and structures, creating a unified appearance across the entire settlement. And that consistency reflects knowledge, because it shows that the builders used what was available. The effort required to build on uneven terrain would have been significant. Adjusting to elevation, shaping stone, placing materials in a way that maintains stability despite irregular ground, and that effort reflects planning, because it shows that the work was structured. The combination of built walls and carved spaces creates a layered design, structures that rise from the ground, and spaces that are cut into it, forming a system that uses both addition and subtraction, and that combination adds complexity, because it shows that multiple methods were used. The purpose of the site includes habitation, protection, and possibly other functions that are not fully defined, because while the structure is clear, the complete use of every space is not preserved, and that uncertainty adds depth, because it leaves room for interpretation. Even now, Castro de Olaica remains, its walls still visible, its carved features still defined, allowing the layout of the settlement to be understood through what remains, and that persistence keeps it relevant. What defines this site is integration, a settlement that does not stand apart from the land, but becomes part of it. Stone placed where the ground allows, rock shaped where needed, a layout that follows the hill rather than reshaping it. And that approach changes how the structure is experienced, because it is not imposed, it is adapted, and maybe that is what makes Castro de Olaica stand out. Not just because it sits on a hill, but because it uses the hill itself as part of the design, creating a settlement that blends structure and terrain into a single system. Walls that follow the land, spaces carved into stone, a layout that spreads across elevation, and that integration.